I'm back. I'm here with Doug Hausler. He is an attorney and a member of the Chelmsford Business Association Board of Directors. We appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks for the invitation. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I originally thought we could have a debate, between the Board of Selectmen that had put this tax classification article on the ballot, but unfortunately they were not interested in debating. So I think it is still important to the general voter to understand what they are voting on, because it is a question on the ballot. So I thought I'd have you come on and still kind of give some explanation as to what it is, how it impacts people, and take it from there. So.
Sure. Well, first, thank you for the invitation. More importantly, I want to give my condolences to your family. Your father was a huge part of Chelmsford history, and he should be proud of the legacy that you're continuing here. So
thank you
my
very
condolences
much
to your mom as well.
I appreciate that.
It would have been wonderful to have the opportunity to have an exchange of ideas with Selectman Diggs in particular, since he seems to be the member of the board most involved in trying to push this referendum. And I'm sorry to hear that he didn't want to show up tonight to engage in that discussion, because I think it's a topic that requires a lot of thought and discussion. It's nice to try to put something down as a one sentence, this catches it all. And the problem is this referendum that's going to be on the ballot, yes, it's non-binding, but it certainly isn't fair. And all you have to do is just take a look at the question, and it kind of plays itself out. So I'm not sure what the referendum's really going to accomplish, other than perhaps to mislead a lot of people that there's going to be some form of tax relief. Tax classification doesn't raise a single dollar. Somehow some people think that if you shift the tax classification approach, commercial property owners are going to raise more money for the town, which could be used to pay for things like schools and other essential services. That's just a complete fallacy. In fact, all it does is shift. If we have to get to a dollar, rather than paying it 50-50, we're shifting it. And the problem what happens in classification in a town like Chelmsford is to shift it for a little bit for the residential side is a huge increase for the commercial and industrial side. And that's a big problem. So we look at the question itself. Most people, when they read the question, they're going to say, well, do I want a dual rate would result in lowering taxes for residents, but increasing taxes for commercial entities. So as a residential homeowner, I read that and I'm saying, I want to go for that. And that's because they're not thinking out the whole process. What's the long-term effect of adopting a policy like that? Once it's adopted, it's almost impossible to get rid of. And you probably remember, and I'm not sure you would, but I think Joe might, because back in approximately 1995, 96, there was a 5% shift in the tax rate in Chelmsford. And to eliminate a 5% shift took almost 3.5 to 4 years. What's being proposed by the various slides I've seen, or the discussions that I've heard by Selectman Diggs, is the first year it was to go up to about 117 to 120% shift. And then once you've gone that far, there's no way you can ever take it back without substantially harming the residential taxpayer. So on that front alone, the question itself is highly questionable. I don't understand the motivation behind it, because I don't see how that brings our community closer together. What it does, it divides the community. You're pitting a commercial business owner on one hand, or a property owner on one hand, and you have a resident on the other. I'm going to vote as a resident. Oh, sure, that saves me $272 if I go along, if I gone with that theory this past year. But then I own a commercial property that doesn't fall within any kind of exemption. It's slightly over $1 million property. Therefore, I don't qualify for any kind of an exemption, and I would have wound up paying, in that case, it would have been almost $2,000 more. The ratios are crazily disparate. And that goes back to the fundamental question that's gone on with classification now for 25 years. What makes this a good policy that you would want to adopt it? So you've heard Selectman Diggs say in the past, well, there are towns around us that use this. Lowell, Billerica, Tewksbury. So then, of course, if you really, that may be true. They do use it. But then you look at the list of the communities that don't have it. Westford, Carlisle, Tingsboro, Dunstable, Concord. Do we kind of treat ourselves more like Lowell, a city, or are we more kind of like Westford and Carlisle and Concord and Groton and Dunstable? I think we tend to fit more of that community. We're more of a residential-based community. We're certainly not Burlington. He used that as an example, and he used Billerica as an example. Well, the part of Billerica he's talking about where that rate where the most effect is that part which is closest to Burlington, which is that much closer to 128. So you're kind of comparing apples and oranges, and it just isn't a fair comparison.
Well, one thing that I think is interesting is that when you shift the burden to the commercial side, it is going to change the tax rate on the resident. Well, not the tax rate, but it'll change the tax burden on the residential side. But people that own wealthier homes would actually see a bigger tax break than people. I think they're trying to help people on fixed income or people that are in modest homes. They may not see the same sort of tax relief that somebody that maybe owns $1 million home or more. Is that true?
Joe, that hits it. That's a great example of why this needs to be more studied and more discussed. And once you examine it, just to lead to that question, that shows somebody that has looked into this. That's exactly what happens. So let me use the example that really comes up, and I'm going to just use rough numbers, because once a community votes to adopt classification, according to Frank Reen, our assessor, Chelmsford is allowed to go up to a maximum of 1.5, 150%. To get to that 150, which is what will happen once you adopt it, it will get there. You don't see communities just taking 5 and 10 cents. You see the 50% rule come in. To get to that 50%, what does that save the residential taxpayer? It's a 4-to-1 ratio. So I go to 150 on this end, and my residential tax base is at 1. But if I've saved a couple $100, but over here, my tax bill, if I have a $10,000 tax bill, my commercial property's gone up to $15,000 in 1 year and forever. And yet I'm winding up, I'm not helping to subsidize senior citizens who have been vested in this community, but I am helping people that may have 4 or 5 kids in the school who are in a $600,000 or $700,000 home and not the more modest home in a Westlands or North Chelmsford or in Chelmsford Center itself. And those exactly what happens. You're shifting it all onto the commercial industrial property owner.
I think one of the, we did have Selectman Diggs on, and he tried to kind of simplify, and he said it's a very simple issue, but one of the things that I don't think is simple is the fact that commercial properties are derived based on what they bring in for rent. And so if you have a renter that's also paying a property tax on top of it, they're going to end up saying, okay, well, I can only afford so much. So they're going to end up reducing the amount of money they pay in rent based on the fact that they're now paying more in taxes, right? So the appraisal value of that building will eventually decrease because the building's just not bringing in the same sort of revenue that it once did. Is that true?
That's very true. And a couple of examples of that. I know Selectman Diggs has often raised the topic of, well, there's this small business exemption. That's another fallacy, because I honestly don't believe he understands it. He hasn't looked at it and studied it enough. In order to qualify for that exemption, the first step is the property has to be assessed at less than $1 million. And then the second part of that is every tenant, every business within that particular property has to have less than 10 employees wherever located. So I'll use an example. I'll use my own commercial property next door. We spent hundreds of thousands of dollars renovating that property on the corner of Academy and North Road. That part of that building is occupied by Jean d'Arc Credit Union. So presume it was not worth $1 million. It still wouldn't qualify for the exemption because Jean d'Arc as an entity has more than 10 employees. So that building is going to get taxed at the highest rate. And that's the problem with the whole concept of not thinking it out. And that's what's happened here. And this question, it isn't this simple. It's much more detailed. Your questions alone are revealing how much more complicated it really is. And I think it does a disservice to our residents. And I get back to the fundamental fairness question. I've been saying this for 25 years now, and Chelmsford has studied this concept and this issue more than any community, I think, in the Commonwealth. We've had no less than 3 or 4 different studies or reports by various committees. I hear now, I've heard Mr. Dixon say stuff during his campaign for re-election that, we're going to need a committee to investigate this a little bit more. That committee, if that was what the intent of this question is supposed to be, have the committee first and then formulate the question. Because the committee may come back, as it has at least 3 times in the past, and said, it's not a good policy. And no one can come up with any kind of data to support why it is a good policy, other than the emotional appeal of trying to reach to the community and say, well, we're helping out our seniors. Your question alone proved it isn't the seniors we're helping. We're helping every residential taxpayer, some who might not need that help all that way.
Well, my concern is that the shift will eventually go back to being the status quo, in the sense that, I took 2 identical buildings. Dennis and I spoke about this on Town Talk, the radio show. But I took a building that was the Enterprise Bank in Drum Hill, and I looked at its assessed value, which was close to $800,000. I looked at the Enterprise Bank, which is on Gorham Street over by the courthouse in Lowell.
Right at the end of the connector.
And it's assessed at like almost, say, $500,000. So that's about a $300,000 dollar difference. But they're really the same facility with the same type of traffic and draw, right? They're really the same. They should be valued really in the same bracket, but they're not, because in Lowell they have a split tax rate. So the valuation has gone down so that it maintains a certain level of
right, in
ability
Lowell,
to operate.
Exactly. In Lowell, it's 1.75, the maximum allowed by the statute. And that it does, going back to your original question, it does have a long-term, very negative effect on the values of commercial properties. And it goes counter to the notion of everything Chelmsford's been doing for the last year and a half, hiring an economic development coordinator to bring businesses to town. So great, we're spending a 6-figure plus or minus salary and benefits on a very qualified person. And the very first thing we're doing while we hire that person is say, well, by the way, we're putting up another roadblock or another obstacle to come over while you're trying to attract businesses. So I'm told, if I'm told I'm going to pay $1.50 per tax for my tax rate, my net income is for that property is going to go down, which means I don't have that amount to do debt service, which means I don't have that extra amount to reinvest into the property. I don't have that amount to perhaps give as donations to schools and other programs in our community. I think it's fair to say that Chelmsford Business Association's members, I think it's well recognized. The local businesses really give to the community. I don't think anybody questions that. But there's going to come to a point, if you're saying your tax bill is going to increase as substantially as being proposed, something's got to give. And it's not as simple as saying, as one candidate for selectman said, well, you need to get a new accountant. That's a complete gross misstatement and a lack of understanding. And I'm surprised that somebody who's running for the highest office in our town would make such a incredulous comment. But that shows it hasn't been studied. Just like this question wasn't debated or questioned, it's just, let's give it out to the public and see what they think. The public isn't informed, you're going to make bad decisions.
My concern is that, again, I go back to the simplification of it, because it's really not that simple. I've done commercial real estate for a long time, and there's a thing called a triple net. And I think it's important that people understand that, because I'm going to take Summer Street as a specific example.
It's a great example.
And this is what concerns me, just in general, but I want to bring this up and get your opinion on it. When you have a triple net, the person that owns that building, it's a strip mall, there's many small businesses within that, they could care less whether the tax burden shifts. They really could, because they have what they call a triple net, and they funnel all of the tax increases down into the tenancies that are there. All of those are small businesses, every single one of them. And one of them is 3 Trolls, and we've had them on our show multiple times. He is not making a fortune. He is not making money hand over fist. He will be impacted by this specifically. The Fireplace place, I can tell you, they're just an honest business doing business in Chelmsford. there are hair salons, there are restaurants, there are people that, they go in every day, they work every day. How is that going to help those businesses survive here locally?
Joe, that's another great example of what I call the oversimplification that's kind of reflective in this question. Those examples, you can go to Drum Hill, on both sides of Drum Hill, where the Drum Hill liquor store is, as well as that which is on Drum Hill Road itself. Those plazas are owned by, in each case, one entity. More often than not, those tax burdens are shifted to the tenants. But the problem is each of those plazas are worth more than $1 million, so automatically there's no exemption. You don't even have to get to the second question about how many employees. They're all over $1 million. So you have the Drum Hill, both sides. You have the Summer Street property. You have the Eastgate Plaza. You have the Skips Plaza. I call it the Choice Fitness, where Purity used to be. All of those, what I call strip malls, quote unquote, all of them will not qualify because they're all over $1 million of assessment. And yet there are dozens, if not close to 100, small business operators who are going to feel the impact of that. And that's a perfect example of why this is a very poor policy. And it's not good to attract businesses or keep businesses, people that have already invested in our community. Basically, our neighbors. They've been selling goods and services. They've been providing a way to participate in our community. They're the first ones to buy banners. They're the first ones to sponsor kids to do certain things in schools. Why are we hurting them? That's what this policy will do. And I can't get an answer as what benefit is that particular business owner taking from the town that would justify that business owner paying a little bit more. There's nothing. That business owner isn't taking advantage of the schools. It's not taking advantage of the sewer service or the trash removal. Those are two very glaring issues that are cost factors in this town. Those are things that the business owner doesn't take advantage of directly.
Well, one other component is, we're talking about shifting the burden onto commercial business, industrial, and the CD, which is just another commercial zone. But one thing they don't talk about is that businesses also pay an additional tax, which is called a personal property tax. Right. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Businesses also are asked to report on assets, equipment, and other basically assets that they have a valuation, and we pay a separate tax on a per $1,000 basis, same as any other tax rate. It's 17.96 per $1,000 of value. Chelmsford is one of the few communities, and I think this has been recognized now for at least the last 10 years by Mr. Reen and the Board of Assessors. Chelmsford businesses overwhelmingly answer what's in their business, and they put in the form that's required to be put in. I think we have over a 50% ratio of returned valuation assessments where people are paying property taxes. That's unheard of in our Commonwealth. The percentages are generally 25% or lower, as I understand it. So Chelmsford's more than double that. And again, another tax, it's paid. But why are we going to add to the burden? And I'm waiting for Selectman Diggs. I'm waiting for Selectman Dixon or Miss Ansell if she gets elected. I'm waiting for them to look me in the eye and every other business owner, whom they promised, by the way, two of them, that they would never do this. They said, we're not for it. It's a bad policy. Well, now I'm entitled to change my mind. Okay, you are. But explain it to the business association before you go doing it, and talk to the people that you looked into the eyes and said, I don't think we should do this because it's a bad policy. What's the basis for the change of heart? What facts? What data? There are none.
One of my concerns in the last debate, which was held by the Chelmsford Democratic Town Committee, one of the candidates running had said that Kronos only left because they were looking to put all of their employees under one shell. But what has been failed to be mentioned is that the largest employers are actually receiving tax incentives to either stay or they're leaving because they're receiving tax incentives. And people have mentioned that taxes are irrelevant to businesses, But I don't find that to be true when Lowell is offering out millions of dollars in tax incentives for Kronos to leave, but then telling us that that's not a big deal.
It doesn't, it's a misunderstanding of what the market is really telling us. Number one is Kronos left, yes, they wanted to consolidate people into one larger complex, but what people aren't talking about is Lowell gave them a tremendous TIF, the tax benefit, such that they're attracting that tenant in who's leaving Chelmsford. But what are the other benefits besides the tax incentive, which they bargained for and negotiated about? So if taxes didn't matter, why did they go through all that effort? Because the city of Lowell wanted to get that business in, and it was willing to pay a price to get that business in. No one mentions the fact that Kronos wanted to get the top billing on the advertising on the top of one of the towers with their name lit up in a direction that you can see for miles from 495 and Route 3. So there were significant other elements to the Kronos decision. The fact that there were amenities within the building for their employees was a factor, no question. Chelmsford's addressing that. They've revised the planning board regulations to encourage, the zoning regulations, to encourage redevelopment of those properties. Tax classification doesn't help solve any of those problems. It is only going to hurt. We're trying to attract businesses. Why are we sending a message that says, we're going to tax you a little bit more? I don't understand it.
Well, the concern I have is, so if you have these large businesses that get tax incentives, and so they kind of get off the hook for it, but you're shuffling all of it down into these smaller tenancies through these triple nets, then really who are you impacting the most, which ends up really being small business. And I think there's another question on that ballot as to exempting, basically property owners, which, I would fall under, and that's fine, but that's not why I'm here. There is a question that would say, listen, if the building's worth less than $1 million and you have less than 10 employees, you would be exempt. And I think that is to try to maybe pander to the business community to accept this as an okay amendment.
Again, it's not a fair question because you have to look behind it and what a practical effect of that question is. So I used the example of the building I have on the corner with my partners where we have Jean d'Arc Credit Union in that building. That building is worth more than $1 million. But let's presume it was worth $999,000. So I meet the first qualification, I'm under $1 million. But I don't get it because they have more than 10 employees. So the only person that's going to really be benefited by that particular exemption, and a perfect example is somebody that owns an individual condominium unit at Courthouse Lane, a CPA, a doctor, a lawyer, a business person of any kind, real estate, you name it. They own a condo unit that may be worth $300,000 and they may have 4 or 5 employees. Yes, that exemption applies. But what does that exemption do? It's 10% off that 150. So they're now down to 1.35. So now instead of paying the 150, they're paying 1.35. That extra 15% shift doesn't go back to the residential community, it goes back to this commercial and industrial property owners who make up that other percentage of back to the 150. So it's a little bit of mathematics, yes, no question about it, but the exemption isn't all it's being played out to be. And again, another question showing how actually disingenuous these are. And one of the things we haven't talked about, and I do want to get across, is these types of questions are policy questions that are vested in the Board of Selectmen. They're not left to popular vote. And the reason for that is because it requires a tremendous amount of attention to detail and discussion and policy in committees. It's not left to the general public because the general public doesn't have all the time to spend to study this. And what no one's talking about is that's a dereliction of duty. And that's appalling. And I think we should hold our selectmen to a better standard than that.
Well, I find it interesting because the Chelmsford Business Association, which you've been a part of, I'm also a part of, has spent a number of years addressing this issue at every debate. They have brought this to the forefront. Their mission statement, if you go on their website, specifically addresses that they were created because small business owners are concerned about the differential. And they've been attacked recently as being kind of, working this from the back end. But the reality is they've always been to the forefront of this is a concern for small businesses in Chelmsford. It always has been. It always will be. And they're the same people that, are running parades. They're out promoting events. I saw Billy Martin. He's part of the Chelmsford Business Association. He was at the Taste of Chelmsford. They do videos on Chelmsford TeleMedia promoting small businesses and things in the community. So they've been a big part of our network. And the fact that the voice has kind of just been lost, I think, is kind of an atrocity, to be honest with you.
I think it is. And, one of the better examples of how this whole issue came up and why it came up back in the 1980s was best explained by your dad this past December when the selectmen were considering this. And he gave the history, because he had it, because he was on the board at the time when the initial 5% classification shift was made. But as your dad said so eloquently that night, and only his style with that glimmer in his eye, we had a good purpose for that. It was to jumpstart the sewer project on Route 129. And the goal was, once we got that jumpstart, we'd get rid of it. And you know what? The town of Chelmsford did get rid of it. Yes, the Business Association had to push very hard from 1990 at its inception through 1996 when we finally got a board that could consider doing that without substantially harming the residential taxpayer. But was your dad, it gave that a perfect example of there was a reason why it was 5%. It was just to jumpstart a specific project. That's not the motivation here, and that's a shame.
All right, we'll wrap it up. Ultimately, how do you feel voters should vote on those two questions? Obviously, they're worded specifically. Are you suggesting that they vote no?
I would say no. I might add to that there was a similar type referendum question, I'm told, 20 plus years ago. And it was much more straightforward, more direct, no tilt of, this is going to benefit the residential taxpayer. It was just a simple question. And the town residents understood the question enough, they rejected it. And that was the message they sent 20 plus years ago. That's the message we need to be sending now. I think residents need to be very careful about not being fooled. And I do think that if this question somehow gets a favorable outcome for Mr. Diggs and the Board of Selectmen looking to go in that direction, it's a fallacy, because it's not a fair question. You might as well ask the question, okay, the effect is if you want to buy a child an ice cream and he lives in Chelmsford, it's $1 for the kid that lives in Chelmsford, but if he lives in North Chelmsford, he's going to pay $1.50. People would be up in arms because it's just blatant discrimination. And that's no much better than what we have here. And that's exactly what they're doing in this referendum question. They're pitting neighbor against neighbor. I'm sure you folks are aware that the vast majority of business owners live in this town. They're the ones that are going to be impacted. And I don't think our residents are going to want to tolerate that. We're one community. We're not a little bit here and somebody's here. And we don't divide and conquer. We join together. And we'll solve problems. But we're not going to do it by going in a divisive route.
Well, we appreciate you coming on. Thank you for giving us more information about the question, and we appreciate your.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. As I said before, I came on. I've avoided being on a local TV show for 28 years, but this question was important enough for me to give up what I would like to do. And on behalf of the Business Association, I was asked to come and try to give our viewpoint and perspective of why this is such a dangerous question. And we hope every residential taxpayer voter says no. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Nice
we
to meet
appreciate
you.
it.